Adjusting to loose players pre-flop. Table dynamics identify the loose player. You do not adjust to a label, you adjust to a set of frequencies. In online pools, the fastest way to quantify loose is VPIP, PFR, and limp frequency, backed by tracking software. Your goal is simple: isolate with value, reduce bluffs, and punish low equity realization, R, hands. First, loose passive, high VPIP, low PFR, limps, calls too much, under 3 bets. Second, loose aggressive, high VPIP and high PFR, opens wide, overcalls 3 bets, can 4-bet bluff. Third, sticky blind defender, normal VPIP overall, but big blind defend is very wide. Each type changes your preferred linear versus polarized ranges, and how often you can profitably bluff pre-flop. Core mental model, why value isolation prints. Loose players donate expected value by entering pots with dominated low synergy holdings. When their continuing range is wide, your thin value becomes thick value. This shifts you from balance first to expected value first, especially under rake and multi-tabling constraints. First, they call raises too often, so your raise gets paid by worse. Second, they defend too wide, so their range becomes capped versus uncapped relative to yours. Third, their post-flop mistakes increase your realized expected value, but only if your hand has strong equity realization. R. Do not respond with hope poker. Calling to see a flop with low equity realization, R, hands is how you burn. Expected value under rake drag. IP versus big blind, build a more linear, open, and ISO strategy. When you are button or cutoff and the big blind is loose, you want more hands that dominate their continues. This is where a more linear versus polarized ranges approach outperforms fancy polarization. You reduce pure steals and increase hands that win at showdown. First, prioritize value opens. Ace-Jack offsuit and better, King-Queen offsuit. Ace-10 suited and better, King. 10 suited and better, Queen 10 suited and better, pocket 9s and better. Second, prefer suited broadways. They realize equity better. King Jack suited, Queen Jack suited, Jack 10 suited. Third, downgrade weak offsuit trash. It wins pots only when folds happen. King 7 offsuit, Queen 8 offsuit, Jack 7 offsuit. Fourth, be careful with low suited gappers in rake. 9-7 suited, 8-6 suited. They need implied odds and clean realization. Against a big blind that overdefends, your open size can increase for value. Use a sizing that stresses their calling mistakes while still keeping your range playable. In many online pools, going from 2.0x to 2.5x or 3.0x is a direct expected value lever. Bluff reduction rule. If big blind continues too wide, your immediate fold equity drops, so your weakest opens and weakest 3 bets lose expected value. Keep the bluffs with the best blockers, unblockers profile, and cut the rest. First, prefer bluff candidates that block strong continues, Ace-5 suited, Ace-4 suited, King-9 suited. Second, avoid bluffs that unblock calls and dominate nothing, 10-7 suited, 6-4 suited, Jack-8 offsuit. MDF reminder. Loose players do not defend using minimum defense frequency, MDF. They overdefend pre-flop and underfight on later streets. You do not need to force folds pre-flop. You need to build pots with hands that realize. The poker place. Exploit framework. First, the exploit. Open and isolate more linear versus polarized ranges. Size up for value. Reduce weak steals. Second, the risk. If you go too linear, you become face up and your red line suffers versus tougher regulars. Third, the counter. If they start 3-betting more, reintroduce a tighter continue plan and add 4-bet value. Keep bluffs blocker driven. Isolation raises versus limps. Pure value, low noise. Loose passive players limp to see flops. They are telling you their range is capped. You punish that with isolation raises that are value heavy. Your objective is to play heads up in position with a range advantage. First, ISO bigger in position, 4x to 6x, depending on rake and how sticky they are. Second, ISO even bigger out of position, but tighten significantly, do not bloat pots with marginal trash. Hands that print as ISO value, especially IP. First, Ace-10 offsuit, and better King-Queen offsuit, King-Jack offsuit, Queen-Jack offsuit. Second, Ace-9 suited and better, King-10 suited and better, Queen-10 suited and better, Jack-10 suited. Third, pocket 7s and better, and selectively pocket 5s through pocket 6s if stacks are deep and they pay off. Hands to stop set mining with unless the price is correct and stacks justify it. First, 2s through 4s when raises get big and stack to pot ratio collapses. Second, 5-4 suited through 7. 6 suited when you are not confident you can realize versus multi-way action. This is anti-hope poker. If you cannot articulate your implied odds and your post-flop realization plan, you fold. Multi-tabling rewards clean, repeatable expected value lines, not creative calls. The poker place. Exploit framework. First, the exploit, attack limps with a value heavy, ISO, build pots IP, deny cheap realization. Second, the risk, over-isolating invites squeeze pots and puts you into high-variance multi-way scenarios. Third, the counter, when squeezes increase, tighten your ISO range and trap with stronger hands. Use position discipline. 3-bet strategy, tighten bluffs, go linear for value. Versus loose opens that call too much, a polarized 3-bet strategy bleeds. Your bluffs do not generate enough folds and you take flops with dominated trash. You shift to a more linear versus polarized ranges. 3-bet range that dominates their continues. First, value 3-bet, wider, pocket 10s and better, ace-queen suited and better, ace-jack offsuit and better, king-queen suited. Second, add suited broadways and strong suited aces as value. Versus wide continues, ace-jack suited, king-jack suited, queen-jack suited. Third, cut low equity, 3-bet bluffs that rely on folds, many combos like queen. 9 suited, jack 9 suited become marginal. Use blockers, unblockers correctly. If you keep any bluffs, prefer hands that block their strongest 4-bet and continue range. Examples, ace-5 suited through ace. 2 suited block. Pocket aces and ace-king and have playability when called. Capped versus uncapped matters in 3-bet pots. If villain almost never 4-bets, their range is capped and your value 3-bets get paid. If villain 4-bets wildly, you tighten your marginal value and punish with more 5-bet value. The poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit, 3-bet more linearly for value, reduce low equity bluffs, print versus call too much tendencies. Second, the risk, if you remove all bluffs, you become exploitable and your 3-bet range is 2 face up. Third, the counter, re-add a small set of blocker bluffs and protect your range with mixed frequencies versus strong opponents. Out of position versus loose. Players, tighten, then attack. Out of position, you pay an expected value tax. Loose players amplify that tax by creating multi-way pots and refusing to fold. Your adjustment is to tighten pre-flop, then play a more aggressive value strategy post-flop. First, from small blind, prefer 3-betting over calling versus loose button opens. Second, from big blind, defend but cut the lowest. Equity realization, R, offsuit hands that turn into reverse implied odds. Third, avoid passive flats with hands that get dominated, like king-jack offsuit versus an under-the-gun opener in a loose game. Multi-way is not your friend when you are out of position. If 2 loose players enter, your bluffing frequency collapses and your pre-flop calls need stronger raw equity. This is where a tighter, value-driven range beats ego-driven, I defend everything play. Scenario box out of position in a loose multi-way pot. Hero hand, 8 of spades, 7 of spades. Flop, king of clubs, 9 of hearts. 2 of spades. Action, loose, cutoff opens, button calls, you call big blind. Flop, checks to cutoff C bets small, button calls. This is the cost of preflop looseness out of position. Your hand has weak immediate equity, low equity realization, R, and poor ability to apply pressure multi-way. Preflop, you should often fold this defend when the opener is loose and the pot is headed multi-way. If you did defend, do not float and hope. Versus two ranges, your bluffing candidates need strong backdoors plus blockers, unblockers that reduce continues. Otherwise, you fold and move on, especially while multi-tabling. The poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit, tighten out of position, avoid low equity realization, R, calls, 3-bet, more for value versus wide opens. Second, the risk, over-tightening, makes you overfold big blind and leak blinds versus competent regulars. Third, the counter, if opponents start stealing relentlessly, restore disciplined big blind defense and add selective 3-bet bluffs with strong blockers. Loose players and 4-bet dynamics avoid spew. Some loose aggressive players add random 4-bets. If you respond by 5-bet bluffing too wide, you torch expected value. Your adjustment is range clarity, value first, and blocker discipline. First, continue with clear value, pocket queens and better, ace-king, and sometimes pocket jacks, based on positions and frequencies. Second, when you bluff, choose hands with premium blockers and playability. Ace-5 suited, Ace-4 suited. Third, do not peel 4 bets with dominated hands like King-Jack offsuit out of position. That is reverse implied odds. If their 4-bet size is small and stacks are deep, calling in position with hands that realize is acceptable. That is hands like Ace-Queen suited or pocket tens, not weak offsuit Broadway. Your objective is to keep your range functional post-flop, not to satisfy curiosity. The poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit, punish random 4-bets with tighter value continues, fewer ego calls, and blocker-driven bluffs. Second, the risk, if you only continue with premiums, they profitably 4-bet bluff you. Third, the counter, add a small structured set of continues, including well-chosen calls IP and a few blocker bluffs. Fast heuristics for online execution. Your edge disappears if you cannot execute while multi-tabling. Use simple pre-flop rules that reflect expected value, rake, and population tendencies. These heuristics are designed for real online speed. First, loose call stations, raise bigger with value, bluff less, do not slow play. Second, loose wide defenders, open slightly tighter, favor hands with high equity realization, R. Third, loose 3-betters, tighten opens in their seats, 4-bet value more, keep bluffs blocker heavy. Fourth, multi-way heavy tables, reduce suited connector speculation, increase top pair value. Fifth, if rake is high, downgrade marginal calls and low pair set mining. Prioritize immediate expected value. When you are unsure, default to value and position. Most leaks versus loose players come from over-bluffing and over-calling pre-flop. Fix those, and the rest becomes straightforward. The poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit. Adopt repeatable value. First rules, reduce bluffs and tighten low realization calls. Second, the risk, autopiloting too tight reduces your win rate versus tight tables. Third, the counter, re-widen when the table tightens and shift back toward more balanced frequencies. Key takeaway, the Poker Place Academy. Against loose players pre-flop, you win by building pots with a more linear versus polarized ranges value core, and by cutting bluffs that rely on folds. Prioritize hands with high equity realization, R, respect capped versus uncapped dynamics, and use blockers, unblockers to select the few bluffs you keep. Do not fund their VPIP with hope-based flats, especially under rake drag and multi-tabling conditions. Now, let's test your edge. Question 1. What stats and frequencies does the article recommend using to quickly quantify whether a player is loose in online pools? Answer: VPIP, PFR, and limp frequency supported by tracking software. Explanation: the article emphasizes adjusting to a set of frequencies and names VPIP, PFR, and limp rate as the fastest way to measure looseness online. Question 2. Against a loose big blind, who continues too wide, what two pre-flop adjustments does the article highlight as direct expected value levers? Answer. Increase open size for value and reduce your weakest steals and bluffs. Explanation. The article notes that wider big blind continues lower your fold equity, making weak opens and weak bluffs lose expected value, while sizing up, for example 2.0x to 2.5x or 3.0x, can stress calling mistakes. Question 3. When facing limpers, loose passive, what isolation raise sizing guidance does the article give for in position versus out of position? Answer. ISO bigger in position, about 4x to 6x. ISO even bigger out of position but tightened significantly. Explanation. The article frames limps as capped ranges and recommends value-heavy isolation with larger sizing IP to punish calls and even larger out of position only with a tightened range to avoid bloating marginal spots. Question 4. Why does the article say a polarized 3-bet strategy can bleed versus loose opens that call too much? Answer. Because your bluffs don't generate enough folds and you end up taking flops with dominated low equity hands. Explanation. The text recommends shifting to a more linear value. 3-bet range that dominates wide continues, while cutting low equity bluffs that rely on fold equity. Question 5. In the multi-way out of position scenario, big blind with 8-7 suited, what pre-flop lesson does the article draw when the opener is loose and the pot is likely to go multi-way? Answer. You should often fold the pre-flop defend with low equity realization hands when it's headed multi-way. Explanation. The scenario is presented as the cost of pre-flop looseness out of position, where weak equity realization and limited ability to apply pressure multi-way make these calls burn expected value. Study hard, play smart. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next lesson.